Hey, it's Kay. And this is Skittles, my editor. Today we're going to talk about fascism because I know how to party. I'm not going to spend too much time on explaining what fascism is. Despite there being so much rampant misuse of the term, it has been very thoroughly explained. I'm going to briefly summarize it, but if you want a fuller explanation, I highly recommend the article Fascism by Umberto Eco. I've linked it below, but it looks like between now and the last time I read it, the New York Review locked it behind a paywall. So I'd also recommend checking out a video on the topic by the excellent Angie Speaks, where she discusses Eco's article and goes into some depth on the topic. So, in short, fascism is a hyper-conservative nationalist ideology that centers national and often racial unity and purity, as well as military power, as the most important aspects of their society. Fascism idealizes a sort of warrior culture in which it is not only natural but necessary for the strong to oppress the weak. It fetishizes hierarchies and has a destructive anti-intellectual streak, valuing action over theory. It appropriates much of the rhetoric of collectivism and champions working in the national interest, but tends to leave corporate power unchallenged, working in the interest of economic elites more than anyone else. Fascism often wears the mask of revolution, with its talk of destroying decadent and bourgeois corruption in society. But is it revolutionary? Well, you might be wondering why my description of fascism didn't mention too much of the economic structure that fascists support. Let's talk about that. There is no fascist economy. Fascist movements, much like revolutionary movements, come into existence in times of crisis, when the wealthy class of landlords and business owners fears the possibility of an impending worker uprising, and/or when the monopolies that capitalism produces leads to a decline in investment and a possible financial crash. Fascists ally themselves with these economic elites, striking deals for their support and funding in return for them ensuring they protect the economic and social status of those elites. Thus, fascist governments have always protected and indeed championed inequality and corporate interests, while leaving the option open for state intervention in the favor of those corporate interests. More on that in a minute. In Italy and Germany, the fascist regimes guaranteed a return on investment for these private interests who supported them, and the wealthy business owners in question were eager to take them up on the offer. After all, nothing opens up investment opportunities like a hot new military budget, a continent's worth of military budget. Now, you might recognize that way of doing things as more or less the current status quo. Why would fascist economies look so similar to our own then, if this is meant to be a distinct system? Well, the answer is, it isn't. Again, there is no fascist economy. Fascist governments throughout history have held economic positions and implemented policies that contradict other fascist states, and often contradict their own stances years and even months prior. But these states are consistently characterized by privatization, with state interference to smash labor unions and other working-class organizations where necessary. And what do they use to destroy these working-class movements, I hear you ask? The apparatus of the capitalist state that's already in place, of course. The police, courts, and military were incredibly supportive of fascism in these countries. The police and courts were lenient with Hitler's brown shirts and Mussolini's black shirts, who carried out much of the street-level violence, letting them off the hook for assaults and murders while imprisoning and executing prominent labor organizers and socialists for much lesser crimes. Often, the fascist goons in Italy and Germany would mysteriously get their hands on police cars and guns to aid them in carrying out their violence. Fascism is often characterized by a vague promise of economic and cultural prosperity at an undetermined later date. When the working class movements have been crushed and all the undesirable demographics and degeneracy have been removed from the nation, it's the promise that after completing a genocide, everyone will somehow be better off. You might find fascist leaders have often been a bit lacking in explaining how exactly these things will lead to national prosperity. So let's take a look at what becomes of fascist governments that are not violently overthrown. How about the fascist Franco regime in Spain? Franco spent his time enforcing Catholicism as the state religion, destroying labor unions, and murdering communists at a horrific scale. especially during the White Terror, in which an estimated 150 to 400,000 leftists were killed. And as soon as he died, his chosen successor, Juan Carlos I, Prince of the Spanish monarchy, who Franco had been personally grooming for leadership, was made king and put in charge of Spain. He immediately proceeded to begin reforming the nation into a constitutional monarchy, like we have now in the UK, and returning democracy to Spain. The post-Franco era was not the post-purge prosperity that fascism promises, it was a return to business as usual, a preserved status quo, but with many of the obstacles to total corporate control conveniently eliminated. And Spain is not unique in this. In Chile, the US-backed fascist regime headed by Augusto Pinochet was reformed back into democracy with the blessing of Pinochet himself, who legalized opposition parties and put his continued leadership up to a vote, facilitating the return to liberal democracy. But not until he was done purging the political left who were threatening the foothold of global capital in Chile. For all the talking fascists do about how liberal democracy is obsolete, fascist governments that thwart violent overthrow tend to give way to the liberal democracy that they were meant to replace all by themselves. And therein lies the key to understanding what the actual function of fascism is, if it isn't its own distinct economic model. The truth is, not only is there no fascist economy, there is no fascist society at all. Fascism is an aspect of capitalism, a protective function within the capitalist system. Think of capitalism as a body. Economic crisis is an illness that threatens to compromise its immune system. Communism and organized worker movements in general are viruses that threaten that body. So, fascism is capitalism's antibodies. Its task is to defend it from viruses and repair the economic crisis, or at least the unrest caused by that crisis, by any means necessary. And when its work is complete, it allows the body, capitalism, to continue functioning normally. And if you're a doctor, don't at me if that isn't how that works. I don't give a shit. That's not the point, okay? Whenever a country comes out the other end of fascism healing its crisis, a substantial consolidation of power will have taken place. In Michael Parenti's explanation of the role fascism plays in capitalist economies in his series Real History, he says this.
According to figures supplied by the Italian press itself, the already meager wages, the wages weren't all that good to begin with, for Italian workers in 1927 were cut in half by 1932. By 1939, the cost of living had risen 30%, and this constituted an additional decrease in real wages. Taxes on wages were introduced. Regulations were instated against minimum wages. The minimum wage law was abolished, in other words. There was no more increased pay for overtime. In some regions, sanitary and safety regulations were dropped. Occupational safety regulations were eliminated in factories. In many areas, child labor was reintroduced. In other words, all the old abuses and old evils that the Italians thought were dead, that belonged to a generation ago, had returned under fascism. In Germany, the same story.
It is unlikely that the wealthy mouthpieces for fascist ideology do not understand perfectly well that the economic function of fascism is to further consolidate wealth and power in the hands of the already wealthy and powerful. No doubt they want in on the looting, and they don't care how many people are hurt in their pursuit of profit. That's the tragedy of the normal people who are sucked in by fascist rhetoric. If they actually achieve their goals, not only will they have committed atrocities, but they'll actually be economically worse off for it. Under fascism, nobody wins except the rich, so don't be too surprised when you see news outlets owned by billionaires using kid gloves when talking about people like Bolsonaro. But we've already seen it throughout America and Europe recently, haven't we? Fascism embraces the most dangerous, inhuman aspects of capitalism in order to protect it. And then, the capitalists expect us to be grateful when the threat to capitalism is purged and we're permitted to return to business as usual. Until that threat returns, of course, which it will, because the inequality that capitalism breeds will always produce a certain amount of anti-capitalist sentiment. And the system of infinite growth that capitalist economics demands will inevitably lead to crashes, as I'm sure anyone viewing this is all too aware of. So if the conditions that create threats to capitalism are inevitable, The illness in the body of capitalism is inevitable. The viruses that threaten it are inevitable. Therefore, the antibodies that protect capitalism are also inevitable. If you're shocked by the resurgence of fascism in recent years, don't be. Capitalism is still here and still in crisis. The two have proven themselves to be a package deal. And that's one of the many great tragedies of fascism, isn't it? Say you're a working class white guy and you know you're being screwed. You know you're working harder for less than your parents had to. You know something is wrong and broken in society. So wealthy men who have the resources and the platform to put their ideas out to the wider public start giving you somewhere to direct your anger. They start promising that if you can just get rid of those people, whether it's people of a certain ethnicity or maybe it's this political group reduced to malicious avatars of political correctness who are holding you back from your full potential, attacking your very way of life even. If you can get rid of them, these wealthy men promise you a better world, and they promise you power, something you were told you would have when you were younger, but society never delivered. They tell you they'll make good on that promise. You're given a whole new lexicon to analyze the world with, and it all starts becoming so clear who is responsible for your pain, your humiliation, as you work your hands to the bone just to eke out a meager shadow of a living, separated from any sense of community and any sense of control. Maybe you get your way. You kill them, deport them, change them, remove them by whatever means. Means that make you sick to think about because you have to do it, don't you? It's the only way to win back the world of your fathers. When the dust settles and the graves are dug, you're told to go back to work. The union organizers, who had once won you your already paltry minimum wage, are in the ground now, so you're being paid half as much. Your boss, well, he was a sympathizer and hasn't been heard from in months. Your workplace, like so many others, were bought up by a much larger corporation during the period of deregulation that you were told was necessary to drain the swamp. Now you check in when you come and go. You check in when you go to the bathroom. You're penalized if you take too long. Every aspect of your performance is monitored and rated. The people in power, strangely, were never the ones who were painted as a threat. And you've won nothing. You carry on like that for 20, 30 more years, while the papers all wax poetic about this beautiful democratic era the nation has entered after the dark times that we don't talk about in too much detail, certainly not in polite company. One day you start hearing a familiar line in the news again. We're losing our national identity. Things were so good when our parents were kids, back before they started arriving on our shores. The paper that's owned by the parent company that now owns your workplace begins backing some of the people spreading these ideas. But you're too ashamed, too humiliated to speak up when your coworkers start nodding along to these men's passionate speeches on the news. But you know they won't win back the world of their fathers. This is the world of their fathers. Your boss buys a new yacht.
This is so wrong, big fucking Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil.
Let them call you racist. Let them call you xenophobes. Let them call you nativist. Wear it as a badge of honor.
We have a new, more intense, more powerful white identity precisely because we are under threat.
And this
What's he doing?
is to go even further beyond